corresponde presentar al profesor Mike Savage, destacado académico británico, sociólogo, actualmente codirector del International Inequalities Institute de la London School of Economics. Mike Savage tiene una larga trayectoria y parte de su presentación va a dar cuenta de esa trayectoria en estudios de desigualdad y análisis de clase. Mike Savage ha tenido una participación en varias universidades británicas, ha sido director de varias escuelas de sociología y ha dirigido también varios centros de estudio durante las últimas décadas. Pero yo quisiera simplemente señalar que muchos de nosotros conocemos su trabajo por la influencia que ha tenido en lo que se llama el análisis cultural de clase, un trabajo que comienza a hacerse más visible hacia comienzos de los años 90, donde el tradicional enfoque de clase social británico es influenciado por el giro de los estudios culturales, también por el feminismo, por el postestructuralismo, y en buena medida el trabajo de Mike Savage reúne un poco esas intersecciones y ha llevado a problematizar, por ejemplo, los estudios de clase media, de identidad de clase media, los estudios sobre capital cultural de clase media, los estudios sobre capital cultural, sobre gusto y desigualdad y las diversas formas de reproducción de las desigualdades y las diversas formas de reproducción de las desigualdades en las sociedades contemporáneas. Bueno, hay varios libros que Mike ha escrito y que son muy conocidos, como Globalization and Belonging, Class Analysis and Social Transformation. Bueno, varios de ellos, y ahora vamos a ver la presentación de Social Class in the 21st Century. También quisiera señalar que Mike tiene una larga trayectoria en estudios desde la sociología, pero que vienen también a problematizar el uso de los métodos de investigación, y durante los últimos años también ha tenido fuerte influencia en debates que tienen que ver con la problematización de la sociología empírica, ¿sí? El uso de diversas fuentes, bases de datos agregadas, y también un poco desafiar los límites de nuestra disciplina y nuestros métodos tradicionales. Entonces, bueno, creo que todos y todas las personas que estamos acá estamos muy interesados en ver esta presentación y entender un poco cómo está imbricada cada una de estas preguntas en su trayectoria. Y sin más, entonces, quiero dejar con ustedes al profesor Mike Savage. Gracias.
Thank you very much, and for that lovely introduction. And it's great to be here again in Santiago. It's not the first time I've spoken here. I'm really thrilled about the collaboration between the LSE, International Inequalities Institute, and COES, which has been developing over recent years and will hope to strengthen even more in the future. I'm very pleased to be part of this joint conference between COES and the LSE, which is very fruitful, and I think the debate I've already heard over the last 2 days has been very, very exciting. So what I want to try and do in the next 40 minutes is raise some themes from this book which came out last year, Social Class in the 21st Century. Another co-author, Lisa McKenzie, is in the audience. It's actually a co-authored book, although it's only got my name on the cover. There's a story about that, which we perhaps go into, but there are actually 8 other authors, including Lisa, so she may want to say a few words in the discussion too. But this book came out a year ago. It's not a new book. I don't want to simply restate its themes. I want to try and put it into a broader context. And the broader context is to think more generally about social class and understanding how social classes are involved in the remaking of politics today. And this issue has, of course, been massively brought home to me and all my colleagues by Brexit and by what's been happening in the UK, and not just the UK, but what has definitely been happening as a result of Brexit in the last few months. And actually, I want to try and argue today that many of the issues arising out of the Brexit campaign underscore some of the arguments we make in the book, and that what we are seeing in Britain and in many parts of the world is a return of a certain kind of politics of class, but it's not the conventional politics of class. It's not the old history of class. It's a different kind of class politics, the contours of which are still being defined and still being formed. And I also want to try today to rise to the challenge of thinking about how we understand social classes, not in terms of different national formations, but also in a more global context. That's an issue, of course, which again Brexit poses very powerfully. So, in fact, my comments today will be quite speculative in a way, and I'm not going to refer very much to the detailed arguments of the book, which you can get hold of and read for yourself. But three major arguments I want to make. One of them is class politics is very much central to the remaking of global capitalism. But to understand the nature and dynamics of this social class formation, we need a new framework. We need to move away from older understandings of class. And a particular argument I want to make is that we, in the social sciences, we have a particular issue that, because we're so concerned about measurement issues, quite rightly, we can get very bogged down in finding a variable to describe class. And I would say we spent a lot of time in recent decades trying to define the best variable for social class. Well, that has its uses, but we shouldn't forget that class is actually fundamentally about the world. It's about changing the world. It's about politics. And it's about class as a unifying, emerging feature of social relationships, which cannot be boiled down to one variable. So I've been very committed to the idea that we need a multidimensional approach to class, which interfaces with gender, immigration, ethnicity, rather than an attempt to define class as a kind of pure variable. And I've also been concerned to argue that we need to understand class historically, not in terms of a presentist analysis of the way class is today. And when the book came out, and when the results of the work came out, there was a tendency to say this is a new model of class, which is that's what we were partly to blame for that, because that's how we called our initial article. But by a new model of class, we didn't mean that we got a new system of class which is fundamentally different from what's come before. It's a new way of thinking about class, perhaps, which builds upon a longer-term process. And I want to argue here that we can use the notion of accumulation to get at some of that process. So this is my overview. And I want to try and focus around three main themes, which I'll try and spend about 10 minutes each on. And only in the last of these themes, the social class and the age of Brexit, will I try and actually return in detail to some of the arguments we make in the book, because I really want to try and spend some time at the start thinking about broader issues in terms of understanding class today. So this is actually hopefully moving forward to what I want to write in the future, which is more of a theoretical book around reconceptualizing social class and inequality. And so the two themes I want to begin with are actually understanding the role of history and theorizing accumulation. Let me begin with this issue of the return of history in the 21st century. That's a rather grand subtitle. And what I really want to get at here is, if we are to understand the contradictions and the complexities of contemporary capitalism, what we need to do is not fixate on capitalism as a kind of fast, turbocharged, neoliberal system in which everything in the past has been effaced. We actually need to understand how contemporary capitalism is trammelled by the weight of history from the past. And in some respects, we can best understand the contemporary situation as a kind of a concretization, a kind of crystallization of long-enduring historical forces, which are now coming to have increasing weight on the present. And I'm very aware in making this argument that we have a language for talking about the forces of the past which can tend to register the past as a kind of passive constraint. We have very deep-seated temporal ontologies, ways of thinking about time which make us think about time as traces, lineages, histories, and which see the present as conveying agency. You can see elements of this way of thinking in the whole notion of structure and agency, in which structure is seen to be a kind of past residue, and agency is always located in present-day action. And I've come to think that actually this is a very deeply disabling way of understanding social relationships, and that we instead need to understand the past not simply as a kind of backdrop, a context, a set of foundations, but actually as having a more dynamic, forceful agency into the present. That sounds quite abstract, but let me try and make it a bit more concrete by just showing you a few PowerPoints on recent trends, none of which are produced by me. I'm just conveying some of the recent work by some influential thinkers, and I'm going to begin with Thomas Piketty, whose work has actually been extremely influential on me. I know his book, Capital in the 21st Century, has gone down as the least read book of all time. There's only 3% of people on Kindle have actually managed to get to the end of it. But actually, it is worth persevering with, because he is really writing as an economist, but he's writing as an economist who insists on looking at the longue durée of historical change and understanding long-term process through the emphasis on capital as an accumulating force. And this is a very famous diagram he produces where he looks at the proportion of capital, that is to say assets which can be traded in his terms, as a proportion of the gross national product in a number of developed economies over the last 40 years. And of course what he shows is that in all these countries the proportion of capital to income is increasing steadily from around 200% to 300% in 1970 to about 500, 600% today. So it's almost doubled. One way of understanding that shift is to say that contemporary economies are actually much more affected by the residue, the build-up of capital assets from the past. So that the national income, contemporary economic activity, is more structured by the weight of these historical forms of capital, which have been steadily increasing. So capital, by definition, is the effect of these long-term historical processes. And of course, this is also linked to his very famous diagram, which is showing the proportion. This is Piketty's very famous diagram, showing, again, in a similar sort of way, the capital income ratio in different European nations over the last 150 years, with the famous dip in the middle decades of the 20th century and the rise of the capital income ratio in more recent decades. I'm very intrigued by this diagram for a number of reasons. One of them is to say that it's in the 1940s, 50s and 60s when that ratio narrows that we find struggles over employment, trade union disputes, industrial relations becoming a particularly marked feature of class conflict. And you can understand that in terms of the fact that actually stored capital reaches a very low ratio during this period. Of course, what happens in more recent decades when you see the upturn of capital is that, in a way, contemporary economic activity becomes a less marked proportion of economic relations. And that may well explain why issues around housing and stored assets, pensions, the relationship between young people and older people becomes more prominent in contemporary contestation and disputes, as we just heard, for instance, in the session just finished about gentrification. So one possible scenario from this graph would be to say we are seeing a shift from a class politics based around employment and income issues towards one more based around housing and the distribution of assets and capitals. And that's a very significant shift. I also want to say a few words about the other side of capital assets. So capital has been increasing as a share, in relationship to the national income. Another aspect is the rise of debt. And this graphic, which I simply took off the web, produced by the World Bank and by The Economist magazine, simply shows the relationship between total global debt and total world GDP. Now, I've no idea how these figures are devised, but it's a very interesting heuristic to see that the proportion of debt has increased quite substantially in the last 30 years. Debt, above all, is the call of the past on the present. All of us who've been in debt will know that debt is a very visible way in which the past doesn't just stay in the past, it comes back and says, you owe me some money. You can't forget about me. So the rise of global debt is a very, very visible manifestation of my point that contemporary capitalism, despite all our images of global trading in nanoseconds driven by algorithms in global centres, that is definitely taking place, but it's a global capitalism in which the shadows of the past, in terms of the rise of debt and the rise of capital stocks, is becoming increasingly significant. And my final slide on this is more light-hearted, but I think in some ways quite revealing. Here we are in a very important university setting, and a lot is written about the knowledge economy and the rise of information society, knowing capitalism, all these motifs about how contemporary capitalism is structured by information, and information which is increasingly transmitted very quickly, and it's very up to date, it's very driven by scientific advances. Nonetheless, when one looks at the hierarchy of informational centres, I'm always struck by the fact that the most prestigious universities are extremely old universities. And this, to me, is counterintuitive. If we're living in a knowledge economy where everything is being driven by very quick knowledge, why should it be the case that according to the COES world rankings, University of Oxford, founded nearly 1,000 years ago, should be at the top of that ranking? It's only understandable, I think, if we place knowledge and information in the context of the accumulation of historical knowledge stocks. So actually, the knowledge economy, whatever that might be, actually is also about the accumulation of deep-seated forms of ideas, information, stocks of knowledge which are located in particular historical centres. What does this indicate for thinking about class? I think it means we need to understand class not just historically in the sense that we need to put things in historical perspective, which we do, but also we need to understand class relationships as driven by forces of history which are accumulating in their power. And in thinking about this, at one level, this is a return to thinking through Karl Marx, and this is a quote from Marx: "Capital is dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labour." I think Marx has been understood in recent decades very much as a modernist, and Marshall Berman's famous quote from Marx about capitalism being all that is solid melts into air has become very influential. But actually Marx, as a modernist, shouldn't really take our attention away from Marx. Actually, is a deeply historical analyst, and much of his analysis of capitalism is about the relationship between dead labour and living labour. And for Marx, the tendencies of capitalism to go into crisis was driven by that relationship. And I think a return to this spirit in which the contradictions, the tensions of contemporary capitalism can only be understood in terms of the weight of dead, accumulated labour is really important. In a very interesting book, which I've glanced at and has informed some of my recent thinking about this, History and Obstinacy, is a very nice discussion about how capital accumulation, is also about the accumulation of bodies and labour power. The other of capital accumulation is also the markers it leaves on human labour, and how that also needs to be brought into the picture. So, this is the way of thinking which I'm trying to argue we need to have at our forefront in thinking about class today. But it leads to the second. Leads to my second set of issues about how do we actively think about history and the weight of time in understanding inequality. And lots of issues around this, and these are things I want to try and think through in the coming years. And I just want to offer some very preliminary thoughts about this. And I should say some of what I'm going to be saying is a bit of a kind of auto-critique of some of the work I've been doing over recent decades, because I'm actually very interested in space and spatiality. At the same time, I think that spatial turn, that movement towards looking at spatial relationships, carries with it a baggage, and it can run the risk of not doing justice to the importance of time. So I'm really concerned to bring time more actively back into the picture. I'm very struck by the fact that many of the key concepts we use for understanding social inequality, social class, ethnicity, gender, are using various kinds of spatial metaphors. So you've had Michelle Lamont here earlier in this conference. She's very famous, rightly famous, for looking at issues of boundaries and how boundaries are constructed. And the notion of boundaries is very widely used by anthropologists to understand, say, ethnic relationships. We hear lots of talk about relationality in the social sciences and how we need to understand classes relationally, which, again, I completely agree with. But that notion of relationality can often be taken in a very spatialized form. And I've got a diagram on the top right here which indicates one way of thinking about relationality as a kind of set of relationships in space. Of course, there's a very deep and long-term tradition of thinking about this. Think of the Chicago School, where social space and physical space merge together. And you can see the way this kind of thinking works. Of course, Pierre Bourdieu, who's been very influential on my own way of thinking, is himself very much part of this spatializing move. The notion of the field, which he uses in his work, and the notion of social space, which he uses in his work, are also part of this spatialization of thinking of inequality. The diagram at the bottom right here is a kind of pastiche of Pierre Bourdieu's famous model in distinction, where he tries to map out distinction between economic capital and cultural capital in this famous figure, two-dimensional figure, where you can see that some people have got economic capital but not cultural capital, and vice versa. Now, I need to make it clear, I mean, much of my work has been using these models, so I'm not critical of it exactly, but I think we also need to recognize that this way of thinking about space has a baggage. One of the baggages is that it tends to define conflict in a very zero-sum way, which, if you think about the top right-hand diagram, in a way the red zone can only expand at the expense of the blue zone. The relationality becomes a matter of contestation over space, which is inevitably zero-sum. I'm not convinced that does justice to the way in which actually a lot of the issues in inequality today are actually not exactly zero-sum in those games, and that there can be different kinds of parties who win different amounts of resources, and they may not necessarily be seeing themselves in this spatial way. Similarly, our concepts even of exploitation and domination, they can lead ourselves to a cross-sectional approach to thinking about relationships in the here and now, rather than the relationships as embedded in longer-term historical processes. And this is one of my criticisms of conventional approaches to social mobility, in which it's often the case that the social structure, the economic structure, is held as given, and the focus is simply upon movements within that economic structure. It becomes a kind of Markovian approach to history, where history is like a relay race. People pass on the baton of history to the next generation, who then take it on to the further generation, rather than recognizing that actually the past remains and it doesn't actually get effaced by being passed on through a particular baton holder. So I don't want to argue against the spatialized model of inequality. In fact, much of my thinking is really about trying to get away from the idea that class or gender or anything can be seen as an abstracted variable, which is kind of detached from space and time. So in a way, that involves thinking about things spatially and temporally. But I think where we are now, we actually have done quite a lot around space and spatialized ways of thinking. We need to be more effective in bringing the question of time back into our analysis. So I think using a spatialized model of inequality might allow us to deal with the zero-sum issue, recognizing it's not a simple battle of them against us all the time. It is sometimes, to be sure, but it's not always. And I'm also very interested in the question of narrative, which I think is, it speaks to a long-standing issue about how inequality is narrated by people, powerful groups and also subaltern groups. And a lot of those contestations are about developing a narrative which gives you an account of where you are, where you've come from, and where you might be going to. There's actually a very interesting example of this in Michel Lamont's recent book, which is an excellent book about the way, for instance, in which black African Americans have a narrative of their history in American society, which includes slavery, the battle against slavery, the civil rights movement, which gives them some resources in developing a narrative for their future, in a way which some other groups don't have that kind of narrative, and that forestalls some of the resources they may be using. So narrative makes us think about history, it makes us think about stories and the way in which we can mobilize forms of time in an active way for the future. And of course, I've got a famous picture of the iconic book by E.P. Thompson, which is in a way all about that. I mean, this is a book 50 years old, but Thompson's making kind of the same argument as I am, which is to say, he was criticizing sociologists of his day for treating class as a set of boxes, is the way he used it. And I'm trying to argue we mustn't treat class as a kind of set of variables. It's actually more dynamic than that. Where does this lead us to? I think, and many of these arguments have been made in the literature. I've been very influenced by people like Andrew Abbott, as well as some of the debates around time even in the very old work by Henri Bergson, and then people like Deleuze. We get a very different notion of time, where the past is force rather than a set of states, and where we see the past as being about certain kinds of propulsion into the future. I think part of this way of thinking involves getting away from the notion that you can cut history up into phases and epochs. Once you start doing that, then once we're into a certain kind of epoch, the implication is that older forces have become less active. That's one reason why I'm sceptical about the value of talking about neoliberalism, globalization, post-Fordism, or whatever, as if it's a kind of epoch. That's where arguing tends to foreshorten the historical analysis. Okay, this is all, again, very abstract. Hope to give you a flavour of some of my thinking, but I do want to make it a bit more concrete in the last few minutes. And I want to say, if we are going to think seriously about this, what metaphors, what models do we use? I was critical of some of Bourdieu's thinking a little while ago for using notions of space, but actually Bourdieu has also, as a central part of his work, got the idea of capital and accumulation. And this is drawn from his very famous article about the forms of capital, which I think is still worth reading today, because he's emphasizing above all else that the battle, say with economists, in this case he's arguing with economists, and what he's saying is economists tend to see the world in terms of competitions taking place in various kinds of instants. And in fact, what you need to do is you need to recognize that the one instance is always dependent upon previous instance. So the social world is accumulated history, not to be reduced to a discontinuous series of instantaneous mechanical equilibria. And that, for Bourdieu, is where the notion of capital and the idea of weight and accumulation is very significant. And he goes on to say, capital is accumulated labour. It's sort of very much a kind of reflection and a reference back to Marx, I think. And it's appropriated, when it's appropriated on a private basis, it enables people to have, I think it's a very useful phrase, energy. Capital is a form of energy. And energy has inertia, and it has effects into the future. It's the principle underlying the immanent regularities of the social world. I'm sorry, this quote was originally a one PowerPoint slide. I did cut it up into three to try and break it up a bit, but it's still put a lot of words here. But it is a very powerful way of emphasising the importance of accumulation. And this notion, therefore, time is not about a series of snapshots, a series of linear states with boundaries around them. It's actually continuous. And we must get away from the idea that we can differentiate time into a series of instant states. So here again, he's arguing against social scientists who are trying to deny the importance of those kind of processes. I'm going to pass on that because we haven't got time, but just to say, I think one of the very interesting points, which actually I'll show the quote in case you have a chance to read it. One of the very interesting reflections which I think Thomas Piketty has on Bourdieu's work is really, he emphasises very strongly he's influenced by the Bourdieusian notion of accumulation, and Piketty makes the point that when Bourdieu was writing Distinction in the 60s and 70s, he was writing at the time when economic capital had been lowered. If you remember that U-shaped curve, that was the point when economic capital, compared to the GDP, was at its lowest. And so you might well explain, or you might well understand in that situation why cultural capital, in Bourdieu's terms, is really important. And then Piketty makes the point, well, of course, since Distinction was written in the last 30 years, we've seen this big increase of economic capital, and that has, in a sense, changed the stakes of capital accumulation itself. So although we can, and we still need to have a multidimensional approach to accumulation, which we're not just focusing upon the accumulation of economic capital, nonetheless, economic capital, one might argue, has a particular salience today, which would have been less obvious in the day when Bourdieu wrote. And I like the last sentence here. We need a new paradigm to look at inequalities that combine the two. We need a new paradigm to look at inequalities that combine the two today. Okay, I've got 10 minutes left. So it's been quite abstract, hopefully useful in terms of thinking about some of the issues which could inform our understanding of class. I want to try and make it a bit more concrete in this last phase by returning to some of the themes of the Great British Class Survey and to go back to some of the arguments in the book. And the starting point I want to make, in a way, is that the Great British Class Survey has been an amazing opportunity for sociologists like myself, who normally write for other academics, to get their work in the public eye and to get discussion going across a wide variety of actors. And I soon came to realise that, in a way, the most interesting part of the project wasn't the data we had, and it wasn't necessarily our way of thinking about it, but it was more the ethnographic exposure to kind of real-world debates. So the fact that 9 million people did a little quiz, which the BBC devised, to find out what class they were in, and the fact that they complained about it and didn't like these sociologists putting them in little boxes, is very informative about the power of class. And that's kind of what I want to try and pull out in this last few minutes. And actually, one of the criticisms made of what we did in the Great British Class Survey is that it was a kind of market research exercise. So we devised 7 classes on the basis of a set of indicators, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it was sometimes said, well, what's the point of this? What are you actually trying to predict? And in fact, we weren't trying to predict anything particularly when we did that analysis. But I think the tensions around Brexit and the political cleavages, which are increasingly evident in the UK, are in fact interesting indications of how the kind of ideas we developed in working on this project are quite formative, perhaps, in understanding the nature of class in the contemporary situation. Just briefly, for those of you not familiar with the project, the Great British Class Survey, very unusual collaboration between the BBC and a series of academics, including myself and Fiona Devine, and 7 other people, including Lisa. And it really came from the BBC, which I think is really interesting, that this was a project driven by kind of public interest broadcasting. The BBC had picked up on the debates about inequality, and they wanted to have a project which they could use for their news channels to promote. And they wanted also to use this as a means to try and show how the BBC could help with scientific journalism today. Could help with scientific journalism today. And, you know, myself and Fiona Devine went into this project a bit naive, perhaps, about how it would work. And we didn't really know how much interest there would be. But in fact, when the survey was launched by the BBC on their website, it did generate a lot of interest, 161,000 respondents. And when, 2 years later, we produced some of our initial findings, and the BBC promoted them on their news channels, there's even more interest. And that itself, I think, is very telling about how class has kind of re-emerged in the public imagination. Now, I'm not going to go into too much details on these kind of boxes because, you know, for all sorts of reasons. This has been very controversial, but just give you a quick flavour of what we argued. And I want to try and show how it bears upon the issue of Brexit and the issue of accumulation. I mean, didn't necessarily think this when I was doing this work, but it's come to strike me increasingly as time has gone by. But what we did basically was we took a series of indicators, a series of variables from our web survey on household income, household savings, house value. So these are measures of economic capital. These are on the left-hand side. Then we took a series of measures around social networks, where we looked at the number of people. We asked whether respondents knew occupations of 37 different types, ranging from aristocrats and chief executives to bus drivers, cleaners and such like. And so we were interested in how many kinds of people respondents would know, and also the status of those people they identified with. And we also asked some questions about people's cultural interests, leisure activities, to try and get a handle on cultural capital, which we broke down into two types: highbrow, with a more conventional Bourdieusian kind of model of going to the opera and such like, and what we called emerging, which is more characteristic of younger people. And then we used the form of latent class analysis to kind of group the various clusters on the basis of these measures, and came up with these 7 classes, which was very controversial. But I don't want to focus upon the 7 classes. I want to just focus upon interpreting the kind of highlights of the finding, if the highlights are the right word. And the first point I would say is really what this analysis is saying is that the fundamental class divide in Britain is really between the elite on the top left-hand corner here and the middle, and the rest. So if you look at the value of the elite for household income, this is actually after tax, after any kind of deduction, after pension payments. Look at the household savings, look at the average house value. This is all massively higher than any other class. This, in a way, is Piketty's point, that in 2013, is the economic capital has become more fundamental than the cultural capital or the social capital in differentiating people in the population. So our measures of cultural capital don't vary as much as the measures of economic capital. So the elite class has become really fundamental, and it's the cleavage between the elite and the rest, which is in many respects driving contemporary class relations in the UK. It's not the more conventional division between middle and working class. If you look in the middle of this diagram here, there aren't that straightforward cut-off points. It's not as easy to differentiate. But if you look on the right-hand side, there is also this very distinctive class, the precariat, which is characterised by having very little of any kind of capital, economic, social, cultural. So really our model of class is to say, rather than fixate upon middle and working class, which has been the characteristic kind of Anglo-American way of thinking about class, we're seeing the pulling apart of class with the rich getting richer, people at the bottom staying in the bottom, and the middle class is being stretched and fragmented on a series of different dimensions. But in which it is the differentiation between the elite and the rest which is playing an important role, crucial role. And The elite, I mean, and thinking about the elite sociologically, rather than as a kind of political science entity, is important, we think. To bring the elite fully back into social scientific analysis allows us to do a number of crucial things. One of them is to recognise, and here, again, the point of accumulation is crucial, that if you are in an elite position, almost by virtue of being an elite, you accumulate. And you accumulate on a regular, routine basis. This is Piketty's point. You know, on a yearly basis, you can expect your assets to grow. And furthermore, those effects often aren't linear. There's often outlier effects at the top. So your assets can grow at a faster proportional rate to those in the middle. Can grow at a faster proportional rate to those in the middle. And also that elite classes are distinctive on a number of terrains, not just economic terrains. I'll give you some examples from the Great British Class Survey on this. This diagram is looking at our elite class, and it's also looking at people's level of household income along the bottom, ranging from almost nothing at the bottom left to £225,000 on the right-hand side, and it's looking at the proportion of people who know a chief executive officer. So if you can see that blue diagram, that blue line snaking up, you can see that once you get to be earning £200,000 a year, 80% of you know a chief executive officer. So income is also giving a certain entry point to social networks. The red diagram is for people who know a shop assistant, which decreases. So you can see how social networks and economic position intersect. This is an interesting figure produced by Christopher Ellersgaard, a Danish PhD student, drawing upon Danish and Canadian data. But I think it's interesting, it's looking at the proportion of sons in the same kind of work as their fathers, according to their position in the income distribution. And the interesting point about this diagram is that for most of the income distribution, there's no variance in the two countries. It's higher in Canada than Denmark, but it's around 40% in Canada and about 25% in Denmark, until you get right to the top, until you get to the top 5 percentile, when that proportion shoots up to 80% in Denmark. Well, of course, we can explain this probably in terms of sons inheriting their father's business. But the point is this: you would miss, if you had a linear analysis, you would miss this outlier effect by which the elite were really very different on a number of dimensions. And finally, on this particular aspect, sorry to whiz you through these slides. This is a slide from the Great British Class Survey, and you probably can't read it, but I'll just try and explain it to you. It looks at a number of elite occupations in Britain, and we had very detailed granular data on elite occupations. So it starts with barristers and it breaks them down according to the proportion of people in those elite jobs who came from privileged backgrounds. So the most elite occupation by these metrics were barristers and judges. 55% of people in that job had a parent in a senior management position. And there's very high proportions too for medical practitioners, brokers, solicitors and CEOs. When you work your way down to the chart and get to IT project managers, even though these are well-paid occupations, the proportion of respondents with parents in that from senior backgrounds falls off to about 27%. My point here is partly is variation, but more than that, how interesting it is that the jobs which have got the highest proportion of privileged kids in them are old jobs. These are not jobs at the heart of the knowledge economy. They are lawyers, doctors, CEOs, and such like. So again, it's the force of history which is in evidence here. So the power of this model, I think, came home really when we think about Brexit. Because I would say one of the very distinctive features about Brexit is the way in which it crystallises very strong anti-elite politics. And I think this is not confined to the UK. I think what's happening in the US in recent weeks, and we'll come to a head next week, makes the point equally dramatically. The way in which sentiment, popular sentiment, is mobilised against elites is becoming an ever more marked feature of the political landscape. And so in a way that I think reinforces the kind of argument we were making in the GBCS model. But there's an important point which Brexit and the Donald Trump campaign brings out, is that this model of class is also about the nation state, and it's about immigration, it's about race. It's not just about class. And I think it's a very useful visual from Branko Milanovic, which allows us to understand that in a very striking way. I mean, Milanovic has a very interesting new book out on global inequality, which I recommend you all to read. And he's managed to assemble a kind of global database. So unlike the usual things where we compare Britain and France and Chile, he's got data on income distribution across the entire globe. And he's looked at the kind of groups which have lost and gained in the last 20 years, well, between 1988 and 2008. And it shows this very... Try again. It shows this very interesting shift that if you look on the right-hand side, the very, very rich have done really well. Over the last 20 years, their incomes have increased by 60%. And the very rich, the global 1%, is predominantly composed of Americans and some Europeans, some from Japan, and also from other parts of the world. So that group has done very well as a result of neoliberalizing capitalism. But if you move down to the 80% position in the income distribution of the world, and these are the lower and middle classes in the developed nations, they have lost ground, and they've lost ground to the group behind them, which are the winners in the emerging economies, China, India, also in South America, and such like. So this graphic, I think, gives us a very interesting handle to understand why the losers, if you like, the lower middle classes in the developed nations are looking to the nation, and why the appeal of nationalism works for that group. Because it is the case that in previous decades the nation state was the device which allowed them to secure privileges over the underdeveloped world. And in a way it's the intersection between nation and class which I think is very powerfully manifested. So when Donald Trump was talking about the way in which jobs have been exported to China, in a way, that is exactly what's happened. And you can see why the group who've lost out as a result of that process would be appealing to the nation state as a means of trying to reinforce their economic position. Milanovic's other point, of course, is actually, although inequality within nations has generally increased, or at least been fairly stable, globally it's declined. Global inequality has declined because between nation inequality has declined. So I think this is a very useful graphic for explicating that. So, I mean, I'm going to finish, but this is just, what is happening in Brexit, and I think what's happening in America is it's the losers, the lower middle classes, the upper working classes of the developed nations are turning against their elites. The elites have done well out of globalization. They haven't done well in relative or indeed absolute terms. And this anti-elite discourse is becoming increasingly powerful. And here's a few visual examples of it, which played out in the Brexit campaign. Michael Gove, one of the most influential conservative Brexiteers, had this very famous quote that we've had enough of experts. We don't want experts. Ordinary people know what they think without experts. And that was a very, very powerful bit of mobilization. I'm going to finish, but my final graphic on this, though, is to say that the Great British Class Survey does map on to the Brexit vote incredibly well. So here we have, I'm pleased to say, here we have a graphic which on the top looks at the proportion of people in different parts of the UK, different parts of England and Wales, I should say, which voted Remain. And beneath it is a graphic from the Great British Class Survey looking at the status of people's social networks. And there's a remarkably close match between them. In fact, we've done various kinds of analysis, and one's social networks, as measured by the Great British Class Survey, it gives that extremely close fit, a better fit than occupational class, actually, and a better fit than economic capital. So you find, London is the area which supported Remain. It's also the area with elite networks. But this map also picks out some outliers with the area around Liverpool and Manchester, and in York and Oxford and Cambridge, where there's also elite networks and where there was a high Remain vote. And of course, this point explains one of the interesting features, which is that the liberal commentariat, the liberal middle classes, were shocked at Brexit. They couldn't imagine why anyone would want to leave Europe. It's such a wonderful place. Of course, they were talking to people like themselves. They had the elite networks of their like-minded people. They weren't talking to people who had very different experience of economic and social change in recent years. So I think, in a way, the Brexit vote is a very telling example of how anti-elite politics, I don't think it's a flash in the pan. I think it's actually going to be a very profound force. It is currently being mobilised on a populist right-wing set of agendas, nationalist agendas. The challenge is to see whether you can try and mobilise that in a different direction. We'll need a lot of rethinking of strategies from left-wing political parties, I think. But if we are to understand this issue, I think we need to move away from old models of class based upon occupation and instead have a much more multidimensional account of class, which looks at issues of economic, social and cultural capital and their intersections.
Pósters que estuvieron aquí desplegados toda la conferencia, así que los invito también a participar de esa premiación. Antes de darle la palabra a Osvaldo para empezar la sesión, a nombre de la Facultad de Economía que nos ha hospedado en esta conferencia y también a nombre del Centro, yo quería agradecer por un lado la presencia de todos ustedes, un agradecimiento especial a nuestros invitados internacionales, a la gente del LSE, Mike Savage en particular, que se animó a colaborar con nosotros en esto y esperamos que en muchas cosas más de aquí en más, a Osvaldo Larrañaga, Matías Cosiña, el equipo del PNUD en general por toda su generosidad en esta colaboración y también especialmente a mucha gente del propio Centro. Parto por agradecer el apoyo de Dante Contreras, director del Centro, de María Luisa Méndez, que también estuvo muy involucrada en temas relacionados con la organización de la conferencia y especialmente al equipo organizador. Muchas gracias a toda la gente que participó y que realmente hizo que esto fuera posible, a Ernesto, a Emanuel Baroset, Alfredo Joañant, Kirsten Sembruch, Jorge Atria, Juan Carlos Castillo, Amaranta Alfaro, a Emilia Brito, a Constanza Pérez, se me está yendo algún nombre seguro, a Manuel ya le dijimos, Alfredo, bueno, en fin, a todos, realmente muchísimas gracias por eso, así que, bueno, Sofía Donoso, así que muchísimas gracias a todos por su tremendo esfuerzo y el cariño que le pusieron también a la organización de esta conferencia. Los dejo ahora con Osvaldo Larrañaga. Osvaldo es alguien de la casa, fue colega nuestro por mucho tiempo y ha estado dirigiendo al equipo de Desigualdades y Pobreza del PNUD, así que los dejo con ellos para que comience la sesión de esta mañana.
Muy buenos días. Déjenme empezar por decir algo que tendría que haber dicho Daniel y se le fue, que como hay traducción simultánea en esta sesión, inglés-español, español-inglés, cada uno habla el idioma que más le acomode. Ben va a hacer la charla en inglés, aunque hable perfectamente español. Lo que sí, los audífonos que ustedes piden y dejan el carnet a cambio, por favor, recordar devolver el audífono y recuperar el carnet. Me dice Amarante que aún hay carnet del día miércoles aquí en la facultad, entonces la idea es que eso no pase. Bien, dicho eso, simplemente déjenme 5 minutos para introducir el tema. Chile siempre ha sido un país desigual, igual que la mayor parte de los países en América Latina. Sin embargo, la desigualdad se ha vuelto un tema muy presente hace muy poco en la discusión pública, en la discusión política, en los debates, en el día a día. ¿Verdad? Hay gente que dice que la desigualdad se ha politizado, basta a ser un tema de discusión. No obstante, en general, las argumentaciones que se dan, las cifras, los argumentos en favor y en contra, tienden a ser muchas veces parciales o no lo suficiente o no tan profundos como deberían ser. Tampoco en Chile hay un texto de referencia, que uno diga, digamos, dónde está lo que uno debe entender o saber de desigualdad en Chile. Eso aún falta. Nosotros en la Oficina del PNUD en Chile, un poco ambiciosamente, nos pusimos como objetivo suplir ambas necesidades y producir un informe sobre desigualdad, que ya está en su recta final y la idea, digamos, es que se lance, se publique en mayo próximo. Este es un informe que lo ha hecho un equipo interdisciplinario, sociólogos, economistas, con algún apoyo de cientistas políticos, y que en realidad la primera dificultad que tiene cualquier persona, cualquier organización cuando se pone como objetivo producir un informe sobre desigualdad es, la desigualdad es inmensa. Toca todos los ámbitos, entonces necesariamente hay que hacer ciertas definiciones de qué se va a dejar, qué se va a tratar y qué no. Y dos preguntas que son muy importantes, que ayudan mucho a esta definición, es preguntarse desigualdad entre quiénes y desigualdad de qué. Nuestra elección fue entre quiénes, entre grupos sociales. Chile, si en algo se caracteriza a nivel mundial, es por su alta desigualdad social, ricos, pobres, clases medias, siempre ha habido. ¿Y desigualdad de qué? De recursos económicos, no solamente de ingresos, sino recursos económicos más amplios, pero también de trato, de respeto, de dignidades entre las personas de distinto trato social y también de cuál es la influencia sobre las decisiones políticas que tiene cada grupo en Chile. El informe tiene dos partes, una parte que es más bien descriptiva, diagnóstico, que es preguntarse y responder cómo se vive hoy día la desigualdad en Chile, cuáles son las cifras, qué está pasando en el tiempo, decrece, estable, aumenta. También una mirada histórica, por qué llegamos a estar hoy día como estamos. Y en la segunda parte, el informe se centra en 7 mecanismos que nosotros son como claves, como las causales de la desigualdad, los mecanismos que reproducen la desigualdad, pero que también eventualmente ayudan a reducirla. Esos son la concentración económica en el tope de la distribución. El 1% más rico de Chile se lleva más o menos el 33% del Producto Nacional. En segundo lugar, el tema del trabajo. En Chile tenemos un problema serio de salarios bajos para un conjunto muy importante de la fuerza laboral, que además tiene rotación muy rápida en los puestos de trabajo y tiene empleos bastante precarios. En tercer lugar, el tema de la segregación. No tanto que la desigualdad produzca segregación, sino en qué sentido la segregación en sí misma se convierte en un factor que contribuye a reproducir la desigualdad futura. En cuarto lugar, el tema de la movilidad social y qué rol cumple y está cumpliendo hoy día la educación para eventualmente desarmar ese mecanismo. En quinto lugar, la relación entre las élites económicas y políticas. En sexto lugar, el rol del Estado. ¿Qué rol juega el Estado en reproducir o desmontar la desigualdad? Y finalmente, el tema de la cultura. Y por cultura entendemos cuáles son las percepciones de la población respecto a la desigualdad, cuáles son las actitudes, qué se rechaza, qué se tolera, etcétera, porque entendemos que también eso es un factor muy importante para ayudar a que las cosas sigan como están o no. Entonces, la promesa es que en mayo próximo ese informe estará disponible para todos ustedes. Bien, pero pasemos ahora a nuestro primer invitado, es la charla central de esta mañana, el profesor Ben Ross-Schneider. Muchos de ustedes lo conocerán, en realidad cumplo con la formalidad, digamos, de presentarlo. Ben es hoy día el Ford International Professor de Ciencia Política del MIT, Instituto Tecnológico de Massachusetts. Previamente ha tenido posiciones académicas en la Universidad de Princeton y en Northwestern, en Illinois, Estados Unidos. Sus intereses de enseñanza y de investigación incluyen los campos generales de la política comparada, la economía política y la política en Latinoamérica, especialmente. También ha publicado en tópicos como reforma económica, democratización, tecnocracia, política ocasional, el estado de desarrollo, los grupos económicos, la política industrial y estudios comparativos de burocracia. Actualmente, Ben está trabajando, los últimos años ha estado trabajando bastante en lo que se puede llamar los fundamentos institucionales del desarrollo capitalista en América Latina, en particular la combinación, la interacción que hay entre grupos económicos diversificados en sectores económicos de la economía, en la presencia de la inversión extranjera y las multinacionales en el sector productivo, en el capital humano y en particular en el bajo desarrollo del capital humano, en mercados laborales segmentados y en crecimiento basado en recursos naturales. La tesis de Ben, ¿verdad?, es que esos 5 elementos no son independientes, sino se complementan entre sí y pasan a formar parte de esto que él es autor, ¿verdad?, de esta línea, esta corriente que se llama, que en Latinoamérica hay un tipo de capitalismo que se llama capitalismo jerárquico. Y eso viene de la literatura de variedades del capitalismo, que tiene una historia también más larga en la literatura internacional. Bueno, Ben ha publicado muchos artículos, muchos libros, pero en realidad la idea es mejor dejarle a él el espacio ahora. Va a ser una charla de unos 40 minutos sobre, digamos, como la manera fácil de redistribuir en la América Latina y la manera difícil. Lo fácil es lo que ya se hizo en los 2000 y lo difícil es lo que hay que hacer. Por favor.
Many thanks, Osvaldo, for a very nice introduction. And thank you and COES for the invitation. And thanks to all of you for this opportunity to present some research in progress. Ahora, voy a hablar en inglés porque es mucho más eficiente para la presentación, pero en el debate, la discusión, podemos cambiar para español. So this is some joint research that I'm doing with Alicia Holland on what we're calling the easy and hard phases of redistribution. I'll want to say one word of marketing for Alicia's forthcoming book next year. She has very interesting work on what she calls forbearance and the informal welfare state. And some of what I'll present today is closely related to that work. But I highly recommend that you check out her work. Some of it's out in article form now, but her book will be out next year. So to start with the easy phase and to look at what happened in the 2000s. Already in the 2010s, we're into a more crisis phase of difficulties, but I think it's worth remembering how good the 2000s were, particularly with regard to redistribution. This table is designed to give you an idea of how many countries adopted policies or went through a process of redistribution to decrease poverty and decrease inequality. On average, by poverty by 10% and Gini by 8%. So overall, a very good record. And importantly, varies by country, but close to half of that reduction came through social policies. So I think it's very important to think about what were the social policies that produced that reduction in inequality and what policies might reduce that inequality further. But already, even in the 2000s, there were signs that there were some limits to the amount of redistribution that could be done through policy, and particularly the countries, in this case, Costa Rica and Uruguay, that were sort of the most equal to begin with, had the hardest time then further reducing inequality in the 2000s. Also then, by the time we get to the 2010s, we see a rapid slowdown in this process of decreasing inequality. So the concept we're working with, or the analogy, you'll recognize from Hirschman and O'Donnell, this idea of easy and hard phases, or easy phases and deepening. Of course, Hirschman and O'Donnell were talking about the process of import substitution. The 20th century, the easy phase that came with consumer non-durables, and the hard phase that came later, involving intermediate and capital goods. So we want to transfer this to talk about redistribution. And drawing on a couple of parallels with their conceptualization of easy and hard, the first is that easy and hard ISI happened in Latin America in ways that it didn't happen in other countries that industrialized. So it was sort of a unique combination for Latin America. Many other countries did it all at the same time, or in Europe they went first with the hard phase. So this is something that has some distinctive quality in Latin America. The second parallel is that talking about ISI, these authors talk about how much more difficult it is policy-wise to move from easy to hard industrialization. And most importantly for O'Donnell, the idea was that you needed to shift the coalitions supporting the move to hard or deepening phases of industrialization. So we think that is crucial as well in these issues of redistribution in the hard phase. We don't, of course, borrow this idea from O'Donnell that you need to then move to authoritarian regimes to achieve redistribution in the harder phase, but we do take up the idea of coalition building as more difficult in the hard phase. So there are two arguments with each phase. So the first is this notion that in the easy phase, you had, coming into the 2000s, what many refer to as truncated welfare states, a small proportion of the population in the contributory system, and most people outside of it. So the easy phase involved a layering of new benefits on top of that truncated welfare state to reach larger groups in society. And it was easy both in terms of the kinds of policy and in the kinds of coalitions that supported it. So the hard phase is difficult on both those dimensions, both in the policy making and in the coalitions. In large part because the labor markets and society is fragmented, segmented, particularly by the informal sector, but also the ways that different groups relate to the welfare state. Some of the arguments that we think do not work as well to explain what's happening in Latin America are, first of all, that it's largely due to democracy that we see this progress in redistribution, with the idea, the sort of traditional Meltzer-Richard idea that the median voter in highly unequal societies is more likely to push through democracy for greater redistribution. That might have worked in the 2000s, but not before or after. So we think it's probably less relevant to analyzing the coalitional base of support for redistribution than it is looking at segmented groups in society and their ability to come together or not. And in particular, we focus on the divisions caused by by informality. Roughly half of workers in Latin America are in the informal sector. In Chile, of course, it's less, but the average is close to half. Another sort of general theory you could think is what's necessary for redistribution is just left government. And certainly in the 2000s, many of the reforms and redistributive policies came from left governments. But also there were right governments that enacted some of the same policies and also reduced inequality in Latin America. And we get it, of course, into the 2000s and the stall, and there are left governments that are having less success in redistributing than in the 2000s. And the last idea that we think doesn't hold a lot of explanatory power is that it's all because of the end of the super cycle in commodities, and that there was greater redistribution when times were good, and now they're bad, and so that explains the outcome. That's part of the story, of course, with the lack of resources in the 2010s, but we think the problems for the hard phase are much deeper and more structural. So I'll briefly go through what we see as the easy phase, some issues in the exhaustion, and then give some examples of what we think of what might be policies in the harder phase to come. As I mentioned, the welfare states coming from the 20th century were truncated, so you had small sort of labor elite in the formal sector making contributions or through their firms to various contributory programs, pensions, healthcare, and other social insurance programs. And that was truncated in the sense that it did not reach the mass of the working population. So what happened in the 2000s was really an expansion to cover millions more people who are not covered by the truncated system. So this is probably fairly well known to all of you. Again, this is just to give you a sense from the table that nearly all countries in the region enacted these non-contributory pensions and conditional cash transfers, or CCTs. And some of the main points we want to take away from this, if you can see, is, can you still hear me? Is this idea that here, the great coverage you see for these pensions reaching a third of the old population for a low cost at 0.5% of GDP. Again, here with reaching huge numbers with the contributory conditional cash transfers, nearly a quarter of families enrolled in these programs, again, at a very low cost of about 4.4% of GDP. So these became quickly very popular in Latin America. They were also adopted by countries in other regions, but Latin America went furthest with these two kinds of broad non-contributory programs. Again, total spending on these is less than 1% of GDP, so the cost is quite low, especially when you look at it compared to the contributory pensions in the contributory system, in the truncated welfare system, that on average in Latin America cost 3% of GDP, so much larger programs just for that pension program, much larger cost. In Brazil and Argentina, with some of the most generous contributory programs, pensions get to 6% of GDP, or more actually in Brazil. And one of the most striking features of the Brazilian contributory pension system is that 2/3 of those benefits go to the richest 20% of the population. So highly skewed towards the wealthier groups in society. Now, thinking about the politics here, of course, broad coverage, low cost, easy implementation. Much of it just went through ATMs. And you could see also the welfare states expanded on other fronts too, in healthcare and education, but they expanded much more quickly in the areas of just monetary transfer. They expanded much more quickly in the areas of just monetary transfers. and mostly financed through indirect taxation without large increases in other taxes or without jeopardizing, had enacted these programs.